Hello everyone, and welcome to the Comprehensions lecture. So we've already seen some sequence operations and list methods in Python, but Python also includes this more advanced operation called the list comprehension. It's super useful, but it's one of those things that sometimes beginners have a hard time being able to read. So what list comprehensions allow us to do is build out lists using a slightly different notation. So you can think of this as essentially a one-line for loop that's built inside of brackets. So we're going to go ahead here. I have the Jupyter notebook open. We're going to go ahead and work through several examples so we can make sure we understand what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is do a building out of a list, basically, an old-fashioned way using for loops, a way we know how to already do. So I'm going to create a list, and I'm going to make an empty list that's just brackets. And then I'm also going to create, I'm going to say, for letter in word, and I'm just going to pass in that string word, take my list and append that letter to it. And then I'm going to say outside of the for loop at the end of that print L, that list. So what's going to go on here? I'm going to build my empty list out. I'm going to go through every element in the sequence that is this string, so that's going to be every letter there, and I'm going to append that letter to the list. So let's go ahead and see what happens there. Okay, so I've built out that list, and it's basically every element is one of the letters in that string. So now I'm going to show you how to build this out using list comprehension. So list comprehension, the format is you basically kind of flatten out this for loop within a list, so, or at least within the brackets. And I'm going to say letter for letter in word. And that's it. That's the syntax for list comprehension. So you begin with what you actually want the list to consist of. So I want the list to consist of the letters. So for letter in word. And that's it. You don't have to worry about this sort of append structure because you're in a list comprehension. It knows that it wants the letters there based on what you've put in. So now if I check what L is equal to, it's the same. And let me go ahead and just make a new object called LST so we really make sure that it's the list comprehension that's doing it. And there you have it. So it's the basic idea of list comprehension that you're kind of flattening out that for loop. So if you're familiar with mathematical notation, this might kind of feel familiar. So sometimes in mathematics, just to type, let's say, something out, so I'm going to change this to a markdown cell to show you what I mean. Sometimes in mathematics you have this kind of notation where you say like x squared colon x in, and then you have some sort of set of numbers. So maybe you've taken some more advanced math classes and this sort of notation makes sense to you. So that's basically what you're doing in list comprehension, where this colon stands for 4. And you're going to say something like x squared for x, and then in some sort of iterable. So that could have been a range like that. So let's go ahead and actually build out that example that we just talked about. So I'm going to square numbers in range and then turn it into a list. So I'm going to say LST is equal to brackets. I'm going to take an x and square it for x in range 0 up to but not including 11. So what's going on here? I'm going to take every x in this range and I'm going to square it, and that will be the result of my list. So that's list comprehension. And also, quick note, we could have done x range here. Since we're using Python 2, that's going to be the same thing. Okay, so again, let's just break down what's happening here. And something that's a little confusing when it comes to list comprehensions, sometimes you feel like you have to know already the results. So when you're writing a normal for loop, you kind of start more on this end first, and then put in whatever object or output you want. And in list comprehensions, you actually start with the output you want, and then define how you're going to get it through some sort of for loop. Okay, so in this example we're saying take my x, square it for x in range blah 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 0 to 11, and then we have brackets there. Okay, so let's go ahead and do another example that checks for even numbers in a range. And now we're going to basically introduce an if statement in our list comprehension. So let's go ahead and make an example that checks for even numbers in a range. So I want a number, I'm going to just type it out, number, and I'm going to write that I want even numbers from 0 to 10. So I'm going to say give me the number for number in range, and I'm going to want up to but not including to 11. Remember, default for range starting is 0. And since I only want the even numbers, I'm going to write an if statement here. I'm going to say number for number in range if that number, remember we can check through evens using the modulo, modulo 2 is equal to 0. So if I run that, now I have a list of even numbers from 0 to 10. So let's go ahead and quickly break down what's going on here. I'm saying number for number in that range, keep that number and build out the list if that number, when it's modded modulo 2, is equal to 0. And let's go ahead and deconstruct this list comprehension to make sure we really understand it by building out a for loop with it. So the way I would do this in a for loop, I would say list, build out an empty list, and then say for number in range 11 if number mod 2 is equal to 0, append it to my list. Append that number. And now the list, you'll see it's the same thing. So the reason list comprehension is so popular in Python is that once you get used to list comprehension syntax, this kind of thing becomes a lot cleaner and more Pythonistic than this for loop. Now, it's kind of debatable what is easier to read. Frankly, a lot of times, depending on how complicated a list comprehension can get, I actually still find this kind of for loop easier to read, but sometimes it's more efficient and just cleaner looking syntax to have everything in a singular list comprehension. And as you start getting more and more comfortable with list comprehensions, you'll find yourself using them more and more. Alright, so now we're going to do a more complicated example. So we're going to make an example that converts Celsius to Fahrenheit. So I'm going to start with a list called Celsius, and it's just going to contain some temperatures that I'm making up that are in Celsius. So 0 degrees Celsius, 10, let's put in some floating point numbers, and let's say 34.5. Okay, so I have my list of Celsius temperatures. And now I'm going to use list comprehension to convert those into Fahrenheit. So I'm going to create a list called Fahrenheit and create my brackets for the list comprehension. And let's build out what we actually want to do. So temp for temp in Celsius. So what's that going to output? Well, that should output basically a duplicate list of the Celsius, right? If I just grab every temperature there, that's the same as Celsius. Whoops, misspelled it. Celsius. Okay, so right now Fahrenheit should look exactly the same. Okay, so what do we want to do with this temperature? So if you look up the conversion equation, what I actually want to do is take temperature. I want to divide it by 5. Actually, wait. I want to take the temperature and multiply it by 9 divided by 5. And I'm going to go ahead and put 5.0 so we don't have any floating point errors since I'm working in Python 2. And then I'm going to add 32 to that number. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in parentheses to make sure there's no order of operations error. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if that works. And there you have it. And you can quickly check, hopefully if you're familiar with both Celsius and Fahrenheit, you know that 0 degrees is the same as 32 degrees in Fahrenheit. So you can see that this matches up. So let's go ahead and break down again real quick what we just did. I'm saying take my temperature, multiply it by some factor, add 32 for it, and do that for every temperature in Celsius. And then because this statement is in brackets, it's a list comprehension and it's going to build out a list for you. Okay, great. Now moving on to a more complicated example. We're going to perform a nested list comprehension. And as you start nesting list comprehensions, it might get more and more debatable how useful and how clean it is, but it's important that you are able to at least be aware of them and read them. So what we're going to do is make one list comprehension. I'm going to say, let's go ahead and do that squared comprehension we were talking about earlier in range 11. Okay, so now my list is every number squared, but I can actually nest that list comprehension. So that's already a list, kind of the same way Celsius was a list earlier, and now I can do something for every item in that list. So let's go ahead and square it again. So I'm going to say x squared for x in, and since I have a list here, Python's going to treat that list comprehension we just made as an already completed list since it's nested inside this list comprehension. And now I should get every number to the power of 4. Great. And you can see that worked out. So you could keep nesting list comprehensions, but just be careful and make sure that you yourself can always go back and read them. And as always, you can use just comments. So I could say here, final result is x4 from range, let's say 4 num in range 11. So if I came back to this later, I would understand what's actually going on. Okay, so later on in this course, we'll actually learn about something called generator comprehensions. And I know I've slowly been sneaking in previews and dropping hints about generators. But after this lecture, you should at least feel comfortable reading and writing pretty basic list comprehensions. So let's go ahead and hop back to the Jupyter Notebook and just make sure we got everything. So remember, list comprehensions, they're basically like deconstructed for loops that are flattened out within brackets. And you can do list comprehensions on any iterable or anything you can do a for loop for. So if you find yourself making a for loop that's just building out a list, keep in mind that maybe a list comprehension is a cleaner way of doing it. Okay, and again, all these examples are in the Jupyter Notebook, so you can go ahead and feel free to explore them later. And we'll be using list comprehensions later on in some projects down the road. Okay, thanks everyone.